Great, awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. I hope you all are having a great start to your day. Appreciate you joining us this early in the morning. Well, I guess it's not too early, but either way, appreciate you joining. My name is William Buha. I'm the interim export control officer here at Chapel Hill. Lance, I can let you introduce yourself before I take it away.
Sure. Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Lance Underwood. I'm one of the assistant directors of research administration at OSP.
Great. And so today, Lance and I are going to go over export compliance for everyone and kind of talk about what we do here at Chapel Hill and make it more of a practical guidance rather than just, the standard lecture that you might get otherwise for other compliance processes, depending on what they are. So that being said, I'll get it started. So I just wanted to go over a few training objectives just really quick to kind of set the course for us. So I'm going to start by going over what export controls are. That's kind of gets to that lecture informational type of material first. We'll really just go over what export controls are, where they apply in research. And then Lance will take it away with red flags that they look for over an OSP and kind of go over how big of a part they play in the export control program. Lance and the entire OSP office really is just an excellent partner for our export control program. So can't thank him enough for agreeing to do this with me. I dragged him along, but no, I'm really excited to have Lance here to help with this. And lastly, we'll just kind of complement each other in going over roles and responsibilities between, not only the export control program checkpoints, but also specifically what we do for sponsored programs. So that being said, I'll start it off with what are export controls, and whenever we use these terms, what does it mean? So I want to give it through the lens of export controls are regulatory requirements managed by 3 different agencies. I think it's important to set the stage by saying that export controls set up different parameters for exporting certain technologies, information, or engaging with certain entities, countries, or individuals. And really what that means is that whenever we run into something that's considered a red flag under export controls or sanctions, we just need to apply for permission, or what's known as a license, to the governing agency that manages those regulations. So the primary agencies that we work with are the Department of State, Department of Commerce, and Department of Treasury. And just to kind of breeze over a little bit of the ITAR, the Department of State regulations, because UNC Chapel Hill doesn't do a ton of military research, but it does occur here. And it's good to just have this basic knowledge of what ITAR is. So the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR, cover what are known as defense articles or defense services. These are things that you would normally assume to be affiliated with defense research, any sort of defense items. It could be anything from propulsion systems to pathogens, or to certain pathogens, as well as things like different technology, satellites, what have you. So, like I said, it's just good to have that base knowledge of what ITAR is. Whenever you're working with ITAR items, they are highly restricted. Almost anything that you're working with that's covered under the ITAR will require a license if you're working with those items, and you involve what's known as non-US persons with those items. Another very heavy, a very present regulatory regime that is covered here at Chapel Hill, the Export Administration Regulations, or the EAR. These are managed by the Department of Commerce. These really cover, I bolded any item. It's also known as dual use items. So these are items that are not only have a commercial use. So, think of your laptops, but it's also items that, the federal government has identified as potentially having a military use. So like I said, these can cover your laptops. They can also cover your phones. These can cover things like pathogens, vaccines, different pharmaceutical materials. And it can really cover a gambit of items, which is why I indicated that it can really cover any item. Just because a regulation may apply to an item doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to need a license. But it's really good to have a basic understanding of what the ITAR and EAR are when you're working with export controls. Very few, and this is why I mentioned the license earlier, very few of the technology or equipment that we work with at Chapel Hill will require a license to conduct research with it or use it in research. But license requirements do happen. And it's really good to understand that, even though you might be able to buy it off the shelf, doesn't necessarily mean that it's not covered under the regulations. And it's always, good to check with us if you're working with any non-US persons on those research projects, or, you're working outside of our standard operating procedures. That being said, the last regulatory regime that I really wanted to go over with everyone was the Office of Foreign Assets Control. So anything having to do with sanctions is typically covered under under what's known as OFAC. So think of any sort of sanction that applies to Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, as well as new sanctions that I'm sure you've probably all heard about in the news that apply to places like Belarus, Russia, and certain portions of Ukraine. These not only apply to the countries themselves, but they really target entities such as businesses, private or non-for-profit institutions, as well as government agencies. And they can also target specific individuals as well. We have screening software that checks a lot of that, but it's really good to understand that OFAC sanctions can apply to, not just a specific country, but anywhere around the world. So that being said, I wanted to go over what's known as comprehensively sanctioned countries. Like I said, it's Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and Syria. And it's an important distinction to make that those 4 countries are what are actually deemed comprehensively sanctioned. So any sort of activity, business engagement, any sort of transfer technology, information, will likely require a license to engage with one of those 4 countries, or any person or entity located in one of those countries. Or the regulations and legalese about it can get kind of complicated on what that means, but it's always good to know that if you're working with someone who is a citizen of those countries, an entity that's organized in one of those countries, or just directly with someone located in one of those countries, that you check with our office first. We can apply for a license with OFAC. Those licenses tend to take pretty long, but it's good to know that we at least have applied for a license before engaging with anyone. Again, you can't really engage until you get authorization or a license back from OFAC, but it's good to know that those countries are really the biggest red flags that you could probably have. Similar sanctions apply to Russia, Belarus, and like I said, certain portions of Ukraine, like Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. It's good to know that they're very entity and individual specific. So with those, bottom 3 countries. So I just wanted to mention them. We often include them with comprehensively sanctioned countries just because it's so difficult to navigate any sort of activity with those countries. So a lot of the work and a lot of the due diligence and a lot of the license applications that you would probably have to submit for the top 4 countries typically apply to the bottom 3. So that being said, I just wanted to go over what is covered under technology. So like I said, if you're engaging with comprehensively sanctioned countries in any sort of facet, you'll probably have to apply for a license. But under the EAR and the ITAR, they're really specific to what technologies you're working with, who you're sharing those technologies with, and who you're giving access to those technologies, and what the technologies really are. So, a lot of the EAR and ITAR designations, which I'll get to in the next slide, are covered under specific lists of technologies that the federal government, specifically those federal agencies I mentioned, the Department of Commerce and the Department of State, have identified as having some sort of military purpose or military use. So, like I said, you think guns and ammunition, military systems and technologies, dangerous human, animal, plant pathogens. I really want to highlight that under the animal, plant, and human pathogens portion, this is not DIRC. This is not related to DIRC at all. This is a much larger list of biological materials, pharmaceuticals, that are covered under both the ITAR and the EAR. Like I said, we don't work with a lot of ITAR technology here, but given the amount of research that we do in medicine, using biological materials, it's really important to know that the list of export controlled materials that would fall under the EAR is much more expansive than anything that would be covered under DIRC, and it doesn't depend on anything like attenuation or amount. It could be any quantity of material that you're working with from a controlled biologic material. That I also want to mention, we also look at things like software. So specifically, software controls revolve around encryption technology. And we also work with things like satellite technology. So these are just some examples. It's not, comprehensive. I just wanted to give you an idea of what export controls can apply to, particularly in the research you're doing. Typically, we look for things that might be coming from the federal government in particular. So if you're sponsored by DOE or DOD, for example, and you're receiving some sort of technology from them, that's something that we would look at to see if it's covered under the ITAR, or if it is covered under the EAR, which is likely, we would just apply for a license just in case whoever you have working on your project would be permitted by the government. And that being said, I wanted to go over what those lists were in particular, as well as other export control related designations or markings that everyone who's conducting research here should really be aware of. So typically you'll see something that if it's covered under the ITAR, it may or may not have some sort of indication of ITAR on it, or it's covered under the list of U.S. munitions list or the USML under 1 to 21 categories. I know I have 20, but I think it's 21. And it'll have the category number as well as the USML designation. And if it doesn't, and you are receiving some sort of technology and you want to make sure that it's on the, you want to check with us to see if it's on the list, you're always welcome to reach out. The other more common designation that you might see, given that any item is covered under the EAR, is what's known as an export control classification number. So I have human and animal pathogens as an example here. An ECCN is also the acronym for it, but it's essentially a 5-digit end letter designation that applies specific controls to that specific piece of technology for specific recipients, potentially in specific countries. So it can get really, really complicated. I don't want to spend all our time going over classifications, but I did want to mention that it's not abnormal to see these sort of markings. And if you run into them, you're always welcome to come to us so that we can clear it for you. And if we can't clear it, then we'll apply for a license. The latter 4 are really pertinent to a lot of DoD research that you might do. Controlled unclassified information is typically designated as CUI. The government is working on methods for making this indication accurately. But if you see CUI, just know that it is subject to additional safeguarding controls, particularly with information and data. Same with CDI, CTI, or FOUO. The latter 3 are much older. CUI is supposed to replace those, but that's not always the case. So it's important to just be aware. And with that being said, I'll hand it off to Lance to get into more of the research aspect on fundamental research.
Thank you, William. I appreciate that. Yeah, so when I think about export control, I think about fundamental research. So I'm going to talk about fundamental research from a generalized OSP perspective. In my mind, it's the best part of why research is performed at the university. It's the broad sharing of research information with the scientific community and with the public. So for example, publications resulting from a project studying health disparities in rural communities benefits the public health sector and helps to improve people's lives. We want those results to be shared broadly so public health administrators can make informed decisions, and so other researchers can learn from those types of studies too. Fundamental research is the most cost-effective method of conducting research at the university because there are no additional administrative burdens relating to managing publication restrictions, managing restrictions on non-US personnel, and also having to deal with increased costs associated with enhancing IT servers to secure controlled information. UNC normally does not perform classified research, but there are instances where we receive controlled unclassified information, as William mentioned earlier, and we must satisfy IT security requirements to protect that data from unwanted access. Next slide. So what is not considered fundamental research? One example I can think of is a Department of Defense project that is developing a new type of chemical warfare. While I'm not aware of that type of project here at UNC, the government will most likely want to restrict the publication, prevent foreign nationals from working on the project, and also impose strict IT data security requirements to safeguard that chemical compound. These restrictions mean the project will be export controlled and therefore subject to export regulations, as William mentioned earlier. These types of restrictions will appear in proposal solicitations and contracts. So it's imperative that OSP catch these restrictions early in the process and also review both documents very carefully. It's also helpful for the department administrator to review the solicitations too. Accepting these types of restrictions is not a complete deal breaker. But like I said earlier, we must identify them quickly so we can educate the researcher and see if we can put measures in place to manage those types of restrictions. One possible way to do this is by establishing a technology control plan, or TCP, and William will talk about that in a few minutes. Next slide. So for reference, and available on the export control website and the OSP website, here's a list of federal FAR clauses that we specifically tried to identify during our initial reviews. The FAR clauses highlighted in red require more thorough review by all parties, OSP, export control, and sometimes the Research, Science, and Security Office, because we have to determine if those clauses are applicable to the project scope of work. So for example, if you take a look at DFAR 252.284 7000, or more affectionately known as the 7000 clause, that is technically a publication restriction. However, there is a carve out too. So some DoD contracting officers automatically include this clause without considering the project scope of work. This can be frustrating at times for all of us, but if we deem the scope of work to be fundamental research, since we're not receiving government-controlled or proprietary information, and have written assurance from the DoD contracting officer confirming this analysis, then the restriction can be mitigated and will be allowed to publish. Next slide. So we at OSP partner closely with export control. We want to work together to help identify things quickly and find ways to keep the research moving, in some words. Actually, this slide belongs to what I just talked about. So again, if we are talking to the contracting officer at DoD and we determine the scope of work is fundamental research, then we can get something in writing where we can mitigate that restriction in the DFAR clause. Next slide. So as I was starting to say, OSP partners closely with export control, and we've recently enhanced our RAM tracker system to help streamline communication between our offices and to provide more transparency at the time of award. For example, if a sponsor program specialist determines that there's a publication restriction that we need to notify export control about, they can check this activity in the RAM tracker and it would auto-generate an email. So this slide here is an example of what RAM tracker activities look like for the SBS. And so by checking this box, export control publication restrictions, it auto-generates an email. And the next slide is an example of that email. And so when this email pops up, the SPS can attach a copy of the problematic clause, the scope of work, and any additional information that's needed for export control's review. And also there's Ramsey proposal information in the email, so it makes it easier for export control to access the full proposal application.
Great, thanks, Lance. So as Lance mentioned, and I neglected to mention this when I was going over the regulations earlier, and it's probably important to note this. So exports can occur here in the United States, and I want to make sure that it's the definition of what it is deemed export is what's important here. So like Lance went over, whenever information is subject to the export administration regulations, what happens is in the United States is if we're working with certain technology, and as that's defined in the export regulations, to primarily refer to information. What can happen is if there are any non-US persons working on the project, what can occur if something's covered under the export regulations is that information can be deemed an export to that person's country of citizenship. So if something's subject to export control regulations, as Lance mentioned, and say you can't negotiate out that clause with your DoD funder or some other federal sponsor or private sponsor, or what have you, and things do become subject to export control regulations, we have our own risk mitigation plans that ensure that any sort of what's defined as a non-US person or someone here, say on a visa from a foreign country that would work in your lab or work in your PI's lab, they can work with certain research, and we can put in risk mitigation plans to ensure that no inadvertent or unintended deemed export occurs to that person's country of citizenship. Or we can apply for a license, like I mentioned, and wait on the federal government to either deny or approve that. Sometimes federal sponsors in particular won't even allow you to do that unless they expressly permit that, as well as obtain a license. But that's also very case specific. So that's why we work with Lance's office and the rest of OSP to make sure that we're doing this in a very efficient way. One of the ways in which many universities, many companies manage controlled export technology or information or software involved with the research project is what's known as a technology control plan. So as you can see from the slide, the purpose of the TCP is to ensure compliance with federal laws or contract commitments. So if there's some sort of publication restrictions, that's typically spelled out in the TCP. We also have implemented TCPs that involve a lot of international engagement and collaboration. So actual export, what you would probably normally think of an actual export of shipping something abroad to a foreign destination. We've set up TCPs for that as well, so that the licensing process is as streamlined as possible. All project personnel are made aware and trained on what exactly applies to the research project in terms of export controls. And finally, the PI signs and attests to the responsibilities that they would normally have under the project. So it not only helps generate awareness with research personnel as well as PIs, it also helps to document that everything we're doing with this project is happening in compliance with any sort of applicable export control regulations. And that being said, certain examples of what a TCP, can kind of include are things like physical security requirements. A lot of the time when we're working with controlled biologicals, for example, we will actually just apply certain BSL levels. A lot of the BSL levels for materials in particular actually exceed what we would normally require under physical security requirements. Say you're working with export controlled information. Typically speaking, like Lance mentioned, under certain DFAR clauses, for example, NIST requirements are required. So we'll spell those out in the TCP. And then we'll have annual auditing and training, as well as initial training to set you up on that TCP or your PIs on that TCP. And once we complete that, say we are auto-generated an email from RAM Tracker, we then set up the TCP, and then we send that back to OSP to include it in the ultimate Ramses record for your project. So that way everyone's on notice about what technology controls apply, what export controls apply, what they need to do, when they need to do it. And we try to make this as efficient as possible, because I know that the licensing process and the research process is really something that we want to get done quickly and efficiently as possible here at UNC. And we really want to complement that. We don't want to hinder it. So like I said before, the TCP is really not a barrier to entry. It's just a plan that sets out roles and responsibilities to ensure that everyone is on the same page and knows what to do and when to do it. So that being said, that concludes the informational part of our presentation, and we're happy to take any questions.
Hi, it's Jennifer Espinoza here. So I noticed that the Ramses, I don't know if this is, you can address this or not, Lance, but I noticed in Ramses that the export control questions have been modified to only ask one question. Is there, to help our SPS, should we be sending more information about export control stuff, like in a separate email, or is there something you'd like to see from us if we see that there might be some concern? Because lately I've been working with a few PIs that have been working with some foreign countries, and I noticed that the few questions that we had to answer before are no longer there. So how should we best address any concerns we see on the department side in relation to
that's a very, very good question. I can't specifically speak to why some of the questions were removed for the export control page on the IPF. I think some of it was just to streamline the information being sent to export control, because Unfortunately, some of the responses to those questions were incorrect, and so it just kind of boggled up their inbox a little bit,
Oh,
and
I
it was
see.
harder for them to discern, what was actually applicable to that particular IPF or not. So that's one of the reasons I think why the number of questions was reduced, and William might have some more background to that. But to your question about if you do identify something in the solicitation, or there's something in the budget, related to working in a certain foreign country or something like that. I mean, it doesn't hurt to add an IPF note and just kind of spell it out for the SPS in there, and just, hey, I found this, might be a concern kind of thing, just something to bring awareness to that. You could also send an email, ahead of time to your SPS or even export control, just to see if that's something that should be identified in the IPF.
Okay.
Yeah, and to add to Lance's comment, the reason that we took away from the IPF stage on the export tab was, like Lance said, we were receiving a lot of emails on things that we couldn't really take actions on. So it was really cluttering up our inbox. And just because you have some sort of international component built into your proposal doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be something that would require a license. It's also one of those things where we can't even apply for the license for you or set up any plan until the award is either about to go, is either about to be executed, or has already been executed. So it's one of those things where we would like to disseminate a lot of our information as much as possible so that researchers can prepare themselves upon award. But that being said, having those triggers on the proposal side and Ramsey's was not necessarily something that helped. We were noticing that, if anything, if we were to put in risk mitigation on things that weren't even awarded yet, we'd slow people down unnecessarily. So yeah, you're always welcome to reach out to us too. If you have any foreign components that you want us to check, feel free to email us and we can look at those before the project's awarded. We've had professors do that multiple times, so it's not uncommon at all.
Yeah, usually for me, it's, someone giving me something last minute, and I'm, I see that they're having to share, it could be human subject related things. And for me, I start to freak out. It's like, we should be handling this not at a last minute situation. So it's always challenging for me on the department side. So, but thank you.
Let's see. If we receive an award for fundamental research that involves a foreign consultant, we do not verify the country or citizenship for that person. Is that an issue on our end that should somehow be addressed?
So would the foreign consultant be the individual, or would it be the foreign entity that they work for? I don't know. Because so why don't, instead of answering your question with
An individual.
So I think that if you're working with, say, like an independent contractor, we do have processes set up around the institution. So we do check through the independent contractor process, and that does check for citizenship. If you are working with fundamental research, most of the time that's not going to be subject to at least the EAR or the ITAR. If you're engaging with someone who's based in Iran, Cuba, North Korea, or Syria, that's something that you should absolutely run by us. And I believe Ramsey's does have visual compliance built into the system. So it should be running screenings on those individuals automatically. So if they were on like an entity list or some sort of sanctions list, that would come up, that should come up and return a result for you as well as us. If you ever are running, some sort of contract or award and there are any concerns that you might have, you're always welcome to reach out to us. But I just wanted to let you know that we have plugged in our compliance checks into existing processes. So it's not like you need to, just know that someone's sanctioned or that they're, that the company they work for is sanctioned. We have tools that are automatically implemented. If you would like access to visual compliance so that you could screen yourself, we have a request tool on our website that you can submit a request through. You do the online module, which takes less than 15, I think it takes around 15 minutes, and then you'll be given access. So I hope that answers your question.
All right.
It
Thank
looks
you.
like there's another one.
Yeah, there is one more. It says, I complete agreements through Alice without payment from either party with foreign countries at times. We often send or receive tumor and normal tissue from patients or DNA, RNA from the tissue. I've been identifying that these do not have any export controls. However, I would like confirmation that this is the correct answer.
When you say you're identifying whether or not something is export controlled, are you checking with our office first? The only thing I would say that is if you're sending anything abroad, anything at all, we have our online shipment form that I would that according to our policy is just, you can fill that out. We'll review it and see if it needs a license. A big thing about actual exports, shipping items abroad, is that it's not just about the technology that's being shipped. It's also, or materials in this case, it's also about who's going to receive them, where they are, what they're going to be using them for. So export controls do apply to certain end uses. So say you're shipping it to a researcher at a foreign institution and they're doing work with it that's for their foreign military, that would be something that might require a license, or would likely require a license. So we want to make sure that whenever things are being sent from the institution to a foreign location, we're looking at it first. So I would say if you're sending materials abroad, submit it through our shipment form and we can review them for you. If you're already doing that, then yes, you are doing them. You're doing it correctly. Now, I will say we do tend to ask in those shipments whether or not, the things that you're sending are on our list of export control materials. If you're saying that, you're attesting to whether or not they are on that list, that is exactly what we would ask from you.